So in part 20, before we move on to working on the enemy spawning system, I wanted to also upgrade the inventory UI. I want to upgrade it because currently, right, you will see that there are two different spots in our game where there is a need for inventory slots. So the first is, of course, when you look at the top left corner of the game, as you play the game and you get more items, right? The slots on the upper left-hand corner of the screen will fill up with items. And when the game ends, right, all the items I've collected will show up at the bottom. There'll be a row of active weapons and a row of passive weapons. I'm gonna just grab a passive as well and a couple of weapons. Yeah, so you see that there'll be one row of active weapons and one row of passive weapons. So if you've been following the series, you will remember that they are coded differently. So the script, the play inventory script, manages the inventory slots here, and for the result screen, right, it's actually managed by the game manager. So we have the same feature but managed by two different scripts. So not very modular, right? Remember we talked about modularity in the last part, and modularity is basically you take the same thing and you put it in different places and they work the same way. Currently this is non-modular because we have the same feature but then we code it in two different places in two different ways. So what I want to do with part 20 is to homogenize the coding for inventory slots. So then the same piece of code and the same set of game objects that are used in the inventory slot UI for our HUD can also be used for the result screen as well. And this is what we are going to do. So the article mentions this as well. And what we want to do is basically to create a new set of inventory display components, and then these components can also be reused for the result screen later on. So to start this off, I'm just gonna go right to the canvas and you'll find the inventory slots over here. So right now the inventory slots, they are more or less the same size regardless of how big or how small the screen is. So if I were to have many items, right, you will see that the slots will cover a lot of the screen. And let me just collect a few items. So now that I have a few items, let me just shift the size of the screen around and you will see that at times this UI is not very responsive. Okay, so the size of the UI doesn't change when my screen gets smaller, and this is something that we might as well fix, right, since we are creating a new set of UI elements for our inventory slots. Okay, so how I know that it's not responsive is because if I just double click on the inventory slots, now you will see the anchor is not split. And whenever you see for a UI element, as we've gone through in part 18 and 19, if the anchor is not split, then chances are the UI wasn't made with adaptivity or responsivity in mind. Okay, what is adaptivity or responsivity? It's just if you change the size of the screen, does the UI adapt itself to the new size of the screen? And it's gonna become a bigger and bigger thing because we have phones in different sizes now. We have screens in different sizes now as well. You have screens that are super long, and then you also have phones that are squares now because they are just regular phones like that, right? But then they can flip. I'm used to making things with adaptivity in mind now because I've done web development for close to 10 years already. Okay, so we're gonna just duplicate the inventory slots over here, and I'm just gonna disable the old inventory slots. And for the new inventory slots, the first thing we're gonna do is to split the anchor. And if you've been watching the other videos, you know I like to split the anchor by just modifying the values over here because it makes the whole thing more precise. So I want the inventory slots to take up about 30% of the screen, and I want also for the inventory slot to take up about 20% of the screen on the top left. So I'm just gonna set this to 0.8, and I'll set these values here to 0 and 0. And what you'll get here, you'll get this rectangular shape that takes up about 30% of the width and 20% of the height. Depending on your preferences, you can increase the size of the inventory slot horizontally as well. I prefer to just have it take up 30% of the screen. And I'm also going to go top over here and then just shift it down a couple of pixels. I think 26 or 28 pixels here will do just fine, and here at the left I'm just gonna leave a little gap as well. Yeah, so changing these values here changes the gap here, and of course on top as well. Okay, so the reason why we want a gap on top is because we don't want to cover the experience bar, and the reason we have some gap on the left hand side is just because we do not want the slots to exist just at the edge of the screen. So for right and bottom values, you can leave it at 0 so that it's right in line with your anchors that you have. Alright, so the new inventory slots here will have a defined boundary, and inside this boundary what we're gonna do is just create a new game object. Make sure that you right click on the inventory slot here and create empty like that, because you will want to have a rect transform. Alright, and I'm gonna call this weapons, and after that I'm just gonna put one of the slots inside the weapons game object. Okay, so this weapons game object, I am gonna rename this to slot, and for the rest of the slots for weapons I can just delete them, and I'll just ignore the rest of the slots here first. Let me just hide. And under inventory slot here, we're gonna remove the grid layout group as well, because we don't want this to create grids. So then this means that we'll just have one slot over here. For the weapon slot, I'm also going to add a horizontal layout group like that, and inside the slot itself, I'm just gonna assign the UI element like this and enable the image. And I'm also going to have to set this to simple and preserve aspect. So later on when I duplicate the slots, you will see that it just fills up like that, right? So we'll just create one slot first, and for the weapon over here, we'll just leave it as it is. Later on, we'll configure the weapons game object so that it lines up in 2 rows, because right now the first row of weapons, second row will be passives, right? So under slot over here, we are gonna add a couple of things as well. Let's add an image this time, and this image is gonna be the icon. And from here, I am going to assign just a generic weapon icon just to show that this is a weapon slot. Like we usually use the blade, right? So we're just gonna do the same thing here. Next thing is to split, or rather, to split the anchor and stretch everything out. So the reason why I'm stretching this is so that it contains itself inside the slot, like this, right? And I also want to have preserve aspect, because later on when we split the anchor and everything, right, there will be cases where the slot will not be perfectly rectangular. So for example, if the slot is not perfectly square and I stretch the slot like that, if I do not have preserve aspect checked, then the image will mess up. Okay, if you've again been following the past few videos, you should be familiar with this. So we always want to have preserve aspect for all of our images so that they maintain their size. The slot themselves, I'm just going to leave it at 48 for now. That's fine. So I'm just going to leave the icon like that, but leave a little bit of margin at the side so that again the icon doesn't touch the edge of the borders. Alright, and the next thing I'm going to do as well is I'm going to add a text element over here, and this text element is going to be stretched just horizontally. And I'm going to reduce the font size to something small, like 8 pixels is fine, and then I'm just going to put a 0 on the bottom. Okay, I'll explain why this is the case later. And for the height, I'm just going to set it to height of 12 or maybe 10. Okay, and then I'm gonna middle align this and then center align this, and I'm gonna move the text all the way to the bottom. So I'm just gonna move the position Y so that it goes to -5 like that. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting a number at the bottom, and this will represent the level. So what we have here is we have a slot with an icon that is the image of the weapon, and then we have the text here, which is the image of, or rather the text that displays the level of the weapon. So then we have one slot like that, and then we can duplicate the slots to get more slots. Okay, it's similar to the grid layout that we had, except that now we only have it horizontally, right? So if you want to lay your weapons out vertically, for example, then instead of using the horizontal layout group, then you can use the vertical layout group. So now that we have the slots over here, okay, if we just duplicate the slots like that, we will get all our weapon slots. Except that now the weapon slots are not aligned with the inventory slots box that we have. So there are a couple of things you can do about this. I prefer to just add a vertical layout group like that, and then this will align everything quite nicely. Okay, so you've got to check control child size in the horizontal layout group, and then in the vertical layout group as well. And this will cause the weapon slots to lay out themselves like that. And then we can just duplicate the weapons and then call this second row here passives. And you can add a little spacing, but before we do that, let's just figure out why the text here is like this. Slot here, we can change the height, smaller value. So as you can see, it takes a little playing around to get everything configured the way you want it, right? And I'm just going to duplicate 6 slots over here, same thing for the passives. So what you want to end up with is you want to end up with a set of weapons and passives, and you want to configure it so that using vertical layout groups and horizontal layout groups, so that you have slots that will look like that, right? And if you do it right, you should get the whole thing to become adaptive. You'll see that when you shrink the size of the game too small, then you will see that the icons become very small as well. This is something that we can deal with later on, right? So if you have the screen be very big, also the icons can look very small. So we can I'm gonna show you how you can fix that later on, but you wanna just have a set of icons like that on the top left corner of your screen that is responsive. Once you are done with that, you gotta play around with the settings a little bit. You wanna make full use of the control child size for the height and the width. So what I would check for the vertical layout group is the width, the height here, and the height here as well, and the width here. And then for the horizontal layout groups on the weapons and passives, I'll just check the width. Height doesn't really matter. I don't have to control the height. This is because if I let it control the height, then it's very hard for me to get the text to show up correctly. Do make sure, however, that your text is right below the box for the icon. So the position will be a negative value because it's under the slot. The slot itself is this box over here, and then the text is right under it. So now that we have everything set up, next thing you want to do is to just pull the scripts from the article, or if you're watching this video, then we will show you a script, and then you can copy the script from here. So before we move on to adding the script for these slots though, we will need to first generalize the data variable and item. What do I mean by that? So the script that we're going to be using, right, it's going to be handling both weapons and passives generally. What this means is that in both the weapon script and the passive script, we have a variable called data, and then this data is a weapon data when it's in weapon, and it's a passive data when it's in passive. Alright, so what this means is that if we were to try and access an item's data, we will not be able to do it because the item script itself doesn't have a data variable. Only the weapon and the passive scripts have a data variable. So what we want to do is to generalize this data variable so it's accessible as item as well. So what this means is that we're going to have to go to the item script and add a variable called item data like that. But if we do that, then we will have to actually remove the passive data and the weapon data variables inside the passives and the weapon scripts respectively. This allows us to manage both weapons and passives as items, but it does introduce a couple of things into our code, which I will cover later. So let me just head into the item script, the weapon script, and the passive script to make these changes. Alright, so what we want to do is, anywhere in your item script, you can just add a new variable, public item data. Alright, so this, just a recap for those of you who have not gone through part 15, item data, weapon data, and passive data, they contain data regarding items, weapons, or passives. And item data is the superclass for weapons and passives. And item data, actually, the item class and the item data class gives us the ability to evolve our weapons and passives. So the item data is superclass for the weapon data and the passive data. So it can be converted into both a weapon data and a passive data. So we add the variable here, but after we do that, we're gonna have to remove the variable inside the passive and the weapon classes. So let me just remove this, and I've got to remove the script from the weapon class as well, right here. So once that is done, you will find in other scripts, you can now, let's say if I have an item, this is just a shortcut to find an instance of an item. So now I can access the data of an item instead of having to find a weapon and then access its data. So what we are doing here is we want to be able to do something like this, to get the item's data instead of having to get the item as a weapon and then accessing the weapon's data. Alright, so this is what we mean. This is what I mean by generalizing the variable right here. But after you generalize the variable, you will find that there are some errors that occur on your project. And this is because we have converted the data variable from a weapon data or passive data into item data. So now whenever our subclasses access the data variable, like for example in the whip weapon here, right, the data variable is accessed. But previously it used to be a weapon data and now it's become an item data. So what I have to do now is to convert this data variable to a weapon data instead, because this is a weapon, right? So then I have to cast this to a weapon data for this error to go away. And this occurs in my script. In my project, it occurs in two scripts, the projectile weapon script as well as the whip weapon script. You can find the script by just double clicking on the error in the console over here and then just doing a cast. So depending on how your project is, because many of you, when you refer to our videos, you actually are creating your own project, right? So depending on how many subclasses you have, whether you have subclass passives or weapon class, you will need to modify any number of scripts in your project as well. Okay, so what you want to do is if this data is supposed to be a passive data, you cast it to a passive data. Otherwise, you cast it to a weapon data, and it depends on, again, what script are you subclassing. So over here, I'm subclassing weapon. Alright, my projectile weapon is a weapon and my whip weapon is a weapon. So for both cases, I'm just gonna need to cast the data variable here to weapon data. So once that is done and you find there are no errors, then we can move on and we can add the script now. Okay, so the script we're adding is called UIInventoryIconsDisplay. So I'm just gonna go to the UI folder and just gonna copy the scripts. So over here we have actually two scripts. This is the UIInventoryIconsDisplay editor. Alright, I'm just gonna attach the UIInventoryIcons component over here, and you will see that the inspector displays a certain way. Alright, but when I create a new folder, I'm gonna create a new folder here called editor, and I add the new script here, UIInventoryIconsDisplay editor. And then what I'm gonna do here is just to copy the script over here, paste it right here. So once I add the editor script as well, you will see the inspector for the UIInventoryIconsDisplay component change. So what's changed is we have this drop down here now, and then we also have a generate icons button over here. So let me just show you how to use this component first before we move on to explaining the script. Alright, so this component is supposed to be added to the weapons game object as well as the passives game object. Alright, so under the weapons game object, once you add it, you will have to add your slot template over here. Alright, so this slot template is just how one of the slots is supposed to be. So why do we have this slots template over here? So that we can click on generate icons over here. Alright, so let's say I want to change the style of the slots. For example, if I want to make the text bigger, alright, I want to make the text like super big. So I can assign this to the slot template and just click on generate icons, and this applies to changes to the rest of the icons. So in a way, this component here makes it easy for us to modify the UI, because just by modifying one version of the slots, I can apply the changes to all the other slots as well. Okay, let me just show this to you again. I assign this to the slot template and click on generate icons, and this will modify the size of all my text. Alright, so it's just a very convenient thing. Okay, you can also change the number of max slots and then generate icons again, and this will change the number of slots we have over here. So this is just number one, it's an easier way for us to manage the slots in the inventory system with the inspector component over here. Okay, the other thing is that you'll see the inventory is automatically assigned. This is because the script automatically finds a player inventory. But what you want to do is this inventory here, let's say if you have more than one player, these slots here will basically contain the player inventory script of the player that you want to show the inventory of. You also have show levels, which if you uncheck, then this will not show the number at the bottom. Otherwise, if you check it, it will show the levels of your weapons or passives. This is something that we didn't have in the previous version of our inventory slot UI. For the paths themselves, right, the paths refer to these two game objects. See, every slot has an icon and the text, right? Okay, so then you want to just make sure that the icon path is the same name as the icon, and then the level text path is the same name as the text. Okay, so these two are just meant to allow the script to change the icon and the level text when the game is running. Alright, and finally, targeted item list is a drop down that reads the player inventory and finds all variables that contain inventory slots. So in our player inventory script, if you recall, we have two variables here, right? Weapon slots and passive slots. So the UIInventoryIconsDisplay over here is coded so that it always retrieves all the inventory slots inside player inventory. Okay, so if I have one more variable here, let's just call this other slots. Alright, so let's say if I have three inventory slots, three lists of inventory slots, you'll see that now this update is to have three. When you customize your game, then your UIInventoryIconsDisplay here will modify itself also. So this makes the whole thing not just modular, but also, you know, adapts to your game, right? Okay, so then in the long run, you will not need to do so much coding. Okay, because once you change one part of your code, then this component will change as well to include the new options that you have. Alright, so because we only have 2 inventory slots, so I'm just gonna remove this other slot here. This is just there to show you how this component works. Alright, so then we are gonna, for the first row of items, which are weapons, we're gonna target the weapon slots. This means that we will read from the weapon slots to populate the slots here. And then for the passives, we will do the same thing, except that over here, icons path is the same thing. I'm just gonna assign the slot template over here and regenerate the icons so that they all have the same name. Okay, so why do I want to generate icons? Because I want all the slots to have the same name. That's really about it. Okay, so you always have to generate the icons so that the array here is populated, right? When you first attach the game object, the slots here is always going to be empty, and you have to make sure that the component here registers all the slots. Alright, so you've always got to click on generate icons to make sure that the icons are generated properly. Okay, so by right, you only need to have one slot. Alright, so you just need to have one slot over here and then click on generate icons, and then this will generate the rest of the icons here. Alright, so same thing for the passives. You set passive slots here and then you type in icon and text depending on what the names of your game objects are here. Okay, you give the names here as well, and once you've done that and you play the game, you will find that the changes, or rather the slots, do not register your items. Right, after all this work, your slots not registering your items, which is a little annoying. So let me just show you what you can do about it. Okay, when I get items, it's not registering. Okay, this is because recall that the old slots are managed by PlayerInventory. Alright, so we've got to go over to the PlayerInventory script as well and drop some updates. Okay, so in the PlayerInventory script, we have the slots and they are managed by the slot class here. Alright, whenever you get a new weapon, you also update the image sprite for the slot. Okay, you can find the slots actually. Let me just show you where the slots are. Under weapon slots here, you can find that there is an item and then there is an image. And this image here points to the inventory slots. Alright, so your inventory script actually references the UI elements over here. Okay, which is not what we want. Again, this is because this makes it a very non-modular way of coding, because then the UI is tied to the PlayerInventory script and you cannot move this UI script somewhere else. Alright, because it's managed by PlayerInventory script. So we want to decouple that. So then this means that you want to delete all these UI elements over here, and you do that by going to PlayerInventory and then just removing the image variable here, and then removing the references to the image variable. Okay, so when you do that, you will affect the game manager. Okay, so we also want to go to the game manager and remove this function over here, assign chosen weapon and passive items UI, because this will refer to the image inside the PlayerInventory. So I'm gonna remove this function as well. So what we are doing now is we're decoupling the inventory code from both the PlayerInventory and the game manager, because we are switching to a new system. So then, as a side note to that, we also have to remove the chosen weapons UI and the chosen passive items UI, because these two variables were being referred to inside the other function as well. And then finally, we have to go to the player stat script, and from here I will also have to remove the reference to the function here. Okay, because we just removed this function, so we've got to remove this inside that script as well, and this should fix all the errors that we have. And now that all this is done, we can start modifying the PlayerInventory script to update the slots. Alright, so how do we update the slots? Okay, so you just remove the references to the UI elements. Okay, so you will see under PlayerInventory here, there's no longer any reference to the UI element. Alright, because now the inventory slots here are replaced with the new slots over here. Okay, so instead of referring to the individual image elements, we will have to refer to the UIInventoryIconsDisplay script. So let's go over to the PlayerInventory script and then let's add two new variables here. Okay, this will be UIInventoryIconsDisplay, weapon UI, passive UI. This gives us two variables on the PlayerInventory script like this. Okay, and then we can just drag the weapon UI here and the passive UI over here. Okay, so then now there's gonna be a lot less work when we want to assign item slots, because we just have to find all the parts of the PlayerInventory script where the new items are added. Because whenever the new items are added, we want to refresh the items that are shown. So let's go over to add, and then I'm just gonna do weapon UI refresh, and under the passive add function, I'm gonna do the same thing, refresh the passive UI. So finally, we also have to go to the level up function, because whenever we level up, we also have to refresh the UI. So this means under level up here, I will just do a weapon UI refresh and also a passive UI. So whenever a new weapon is added, new passive is added, or whenever an item levels up, then we just refresh all the UI. And this will cause the UI now to work properly. Okay, now we have an X, so then you'll see there's X here and then there's a 1. And when I get new items, you will see that it fills up the slots. And as I level up, you will see also that now the slots will reflect accordingly. Okay, so garlic is level 2, right? So you'll see here now that the text here becomes 2. Okay, so now we have a weapon UI that shows you the level, shows you the weapon itself, and it's also modularized. Okay, before we apply this to the results screen, however, I want to just talk a little bit about how the script works. So let's head over to the inventory icons display script and let's run through the whole thing. Okay, so the inventory icons display script actually only has one function that matters. It's the refresh function. It's the same function that we just called in the play inventory script a couple of times, all right, in the level up function as well as in the add functions. What the refresh function does is it just cycles through the variable that is assigned here. So if I head over to the inventory slots here and I head over to the component here, you will see this either reads, this icons display here either reads from the weapon slots variable or the passive slots variable. Okay, so whatever is assigned here, it just reads through the variable. Over here, there's the code for reading the variable is pretty complex because it uses reflection. What is reflection? Reflection is basically using a string to get a certain variable name. Okay, because we can't possibly just go and get the inventory and then weapon slots, right? We can't just access it like that because this is a variable, if it makes sense. Okay, so this can be any variable name. So I cannot just do inventory dot something. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm getting the field called targeted item list. Targeted item list is this variable right here. Okay, so whatever the name of the targeted item list is, I'm trying to get that variable using the getField method. This is inside C#'s reflection library. Right, so then I want to get this variable, and if it is a public variable and if it's an instance variable. Okay, so if you look at the play inventory script, I have two sets of slots, alright, and these are public and this is also an instance. What does it mean by instance? Meaning it's not static, right? Because it's not static, it's an instance variable. Okay, so we find all public variables that are also instance variables, and then if it's a name that's reflected here and we can get the field, then we will assign this field to the variable over here. Okay, after that we just loop through all the inventory slots and then we update the data for the items. Alright, so the complex part really is just getting the variable, because again we cannot get the variable by typing the variable name in directly. We have to retrieve the variable from the targeted item list over here. Alright, so the long story short, okay, you can copy the code and then you can read through the code and you can get a sense of how this works. You can also put it in ChatGPT and it will explain to you what the code is doing. Alright, so the main thing you want to take away from this is that refresh will refresh the display of the inventory slots. Okay, so there are two ways that we can implement refresh. One way is that we can call it manually whenever we want to refresh the UI. If you want the UI to always reflect, you can always just put refresh inside update. I do not recommend this though, because this makes the UI inventory icons display very expensive, because now it is trying to update the inventory every frame. This makes it easier to use, but I really don't recommend it because it makes your script inefficient. You really don't have to update your inventory slots every frame. Okay, but if you add this piece of code though, then you no longer have to call the functions inside play inventory. Alright, so over here we manually call the function every time we update the slots. Okay, because again this is more efficient than calling the refresh function and the update function every frame. So the rest of the functions are just there to the reset function. Again, it populates the variables. Okay, so if I add a new component over here, you will see that some of the variables are automatically populated. See that slot here is automatically populated. Inventory here is automatically populated as well. This is because in the reset function, these variables are populated. So it's just a way for us to preset the fields inside our component. On enable, what it does is it just calls refresh. So whenever a UI screen activates, then it will just update the inventory slots. Okay, this will be relevant to us later when we port the inventory slots that we have over to the result screen. So now that we have all the inventory slots, the scripts are explained. Okay, I'm just gonna talk about the editor script as well. Okay, the editor script, what it does is that it adds two new fields over here, the targeted item list as well as the button over here. Okay, that allows us to regenerate all the slots. Okay, so I've explained what this button does. Okay, so why do we why do we want to add these two? Because it's just for us to have this drop down, right? Because there is no other way for us to implement this drop down, right? If you look at how this is implemented, this targeted item list variable, I've actually, in the original script, I've actually made this variable hidden. The reason I made it hidden is because if I were to make it unhidden, then you will see targeted item list is actually a string. Okay, I do not want this to be a string. What I want is for this to be a drop down, and then when I change the drop down, it updates the string like that. Okay, so what I've done instead is I've hidden this variable, and then I've created, using the editor script, a drop down that will update the string variable, which is what you saw just now, right? So this makes it more user friendly, right? Because if I were to allow the user to type in the string directly, then you know, if you type in the wrong fields, then it will create errors and then your inventory will not update. So this is a way of making sure that my component is less error prone, okay, because you disallow the user from typing their own values, right? So this is done, it's a whole bunch of code that enables this. So what it does basically is it just reads the PlayerInventory class, and it finds all the fields that are public and that are not static, okay? And then they are also of the type PlayerInventory slot, right? So I'm finding PlayerInventory, and then I'm looking for the slot variable, see that? And then from there, if I find the slot variable, I just add this to a list. And then this list is managed and then inserted into a drop down that is right here. So the drop down is drawn by using the editor GUI layout and then doing a pop-up. And then this is the variable name, and these are the options for the drop down. Okay. And then this value here is the selected option for the drop down. Okay, so what we have here, if you look at the drop down over here, this is 3 options, right? None, weapon slots, passive slots. Okay, so this will be 0, 1, and 2. Okay, so then this value here, why am I doing a max and then 0 here? This is so that if this value is negative, then this will be 0, which will select none. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating this element over here and making sure that the default value is none, and then you can select your own values. All right. The rest of these functions over here, like for example, begin editor check and end editor change check, this is just so that when I update the editor, the Unity will save the value for me, so that the drop down does not. So the drop down does not, you know, like if I select the values here, the drop down does not lose the value. Okay, otherwise, if I update this drop down over here and I deselect it, I select it again, then the value will not be saved. Okay, so these are just editor shenanigans that I do to make sure that you save the value that I assign to it. Okay, and then set dirty, basically what this does is whenever you change a value in the scene, right? Okay, you will find that a star appears here. Okay, so set dirty, what it does is it adds a star over here so that it makes the editor register there is a change, so that you have to Control S to save the scene. Okay, these are all more advanced things that you can play around with. Most of this code that I've gotten here actually is from ChatGPT. Okay, so of course I understand what the code is doing, so I had to modify the code, but I got the code basically just by asking ChatGPT by telling it what I need, and then it generating a code for me, and then me modifying the code to meet my needs. Alright, the button itself is generated using GUI layout.button, and then it calls this function called regenerate icons. And what regenerate icons does is that it deletes all the slot game objects and just duplicates the existing game objects. Sorry, the existing slot template. So what this generate icons does is basically it deletes all the slots and then it duplicates the slots. Okay. After duplicating all the slots, you will go to this slots array here and then just assign each of the slots inside. Okay. So if I click on this, you will see that the same thing happens. Right. So this is important to click on because this allows the component to find all the slots under it so that it can manage the slots when the game is running. So clicking on this is very important every time after you are done configuring the settings over here, and click on generate icons to get the icons registered. Okay, so the reason why I created an inspector script is because I wanted to customize the last 2 options of the inspector. Alright, you can read more if you're interested in customizing your own inspector templates as well. You can read more about this by just going to Google, and then you can find Unity Custom Inspector. There should be a couple of tutorials from Unity themselves that you can read through to get a sense of how this works. This can be very useful, but you can get by without using this as well. Okay, so the reason I'm using this is because I'm again creating scripts that will adapt when you change other parts of your code, right? So in our case here, I wanted this to adapt whenever PlayerInventory is updated with more classes of slots. Alright, that was why we have this drop down over here. Okay, so now that we have all the slots in place and they are working, we have to move this over to the result screen because the result screen is still using the old slot system. Okay, so let me just do that. So let me just turn on the result screen next. And from the result screen, okay, you will see a couple of problems in the result screen. The first is that if the screen is too small, then it's not responsive, alright? The responsive portion is pretty easy to fix. So let's fix that first, alright? So as I've always talked about, whenever you have a screen that is not responsive, what you have to do is find all the elements that are not responsive and then make them responsive by splitting the anchor. So I'm just gonna grab the divider over here, first thing, and I will open the rect transform. And how do I make this line responsive? Alright, right now it's not responsive, right? Because if I shrink the size of the screen, vertically the line will extend beyond the screen, and I don't want that. So to do that, just split the anchor. Because the line is only one dimensional, right? So I can get away by just splitting the anchor vertically. So I'm just gonna set the Y over here to 0.1. Okay, maybe it's not good at 0.15, somewhere here, and the max will be 0.8. And what this does is moves the anchor to here and here, right? If you want it to be higher value, you can always just increase the anchor over here. Once that's done, set top to 0, bottom to 0. Okay, so that the line always follows the anchor. And this will make the line adaptive, right? See that? Okay. So you have to find a value that works for you. So for example, if you find that the line is still overlapping at certain parts, you can always reduce the values over here. And of course, always set the values top and bottom back to 0. And you see that it becomes a lot more responsive, right? Okay. How about the horizontal responsiveness? Okay, this can be fixed by looking at the elements that are not responsive at the moment. Okay, so we have time survived and level survived. Level reached, sorry. Time survived holder. Okay, so here we want to make the element responsive horizontally. So again, I'm gonna have to play around with the anchor a little bit. I'm gonna set the horizontal anchor to be like that, so that I want the entire element to only be contained within around 40% of the screen, like that. Okay, next I want to find a value for the anchor that corresponds to the position of the text now. So I'm just gonna go with 0.6 and 0.7 here. And you see that this gives me a box that appears like that. Okay, then I can set everything to 0, 0, 0, and this will move the text all over like that. Okay, next thing I want to do is under the text here, I'm just gonna stretch. Okay, so under the holder here, notice I've defined a box like that. Alright, so now that the box is defined, I can just go to the text and stretch it. I can go to the display time and stretch it as well. Okay, and then for the text element here, instead of having it be a value of 1, which means it fills up the entire box, right? It will just fill up half of the box. And then I've got to set the right here to 0. So what I've got here is a box like that, and this text takes up 50% of it. Alright, because I've set the anchor to 0, 0.5, and then these values here are 0. For the display time, same thing. Okay, this will take up half, so it's 0.5 to 1. Then I'll set the left value here to 0. And now you will see that I have a time survived holder that has box like that, and then the text takes up half, the display takes up half. Right. So now let's do the same thing for level reached as well. For level reached, I want to again modify the anchor to the appropriate values. Okay, I want this under, right? So this should be 0.5, 0.6. So you'll see the box is under here, right? And then I can set this to 0, 0, 0, 0. So then you'll see the box is now right under time survived. And for the text, again, I will just stretch it. And then modify it to take up 50% of the screen, or rather 50% of the parent instead of 100%. And display time, same thing, I'll stretch it like this. And then set this to 0.5, and this will be 0. So now that I've modified the elements like that, okay, you will see that this now becomes responsive. Okay, so we can do the same thing for a chosen character as well, and then that will make it responsive as well. So let's just do that. Chosen character holder, I'm just gonna define the boundaries for it horizontally and then vertically as well. This will be 0.5 to 0.7. Set the margins to 0, and this will make the element like that. And then next thing I want to do is go to the children element and then just stretch it across. So the image will be stretched across like that, but I want to limit the image to be 20%. Alright, so I'm just gonna set 0.2 over here, set the right to 0 like that, and then the image will now be contained within a certain boundary. Name, same thing, I'll stretch it, and then I will move it so that it's the boundaries are after the image. And then again, I set the margin, it's all to 0, and I center a line. Chosen character. Okay, so now this makes the whole thing responsive. See that? So for the text, you have a couple of options. Usually for the text, I like to make, because these are all single line text, right? So I actually like to make the text adapt to the size of the box as well. What do I mean by that? I'll just auto size. Okay, I can just auto size this, and then this will cause the text to increase in size or decrease in size respectively. Okay, I'll leave you to decide if you want to go with this. Okay, so if you want to do that, you have to also make sure that the boundaries are set. So for example, if I do that for chosen character, you see the text now takes up the entire box. Okay, and then when I resize, you see that the text will size itself accordingly. Okay, this makes it so that the text can be of different sizes at certain screen sizes. So I generally do not like to use auto size, but it's an option there if you want to do that. Okay, I'm just gonna leave the text at its original sizes like that. Okay, so then it's just gonna shift itself like that, but the size of the text doesn't really change. Okay, last thing I want to do is this box here doesn't look very nice, so I'm just gonna replace it with one of the engine sprites. Okay, so Unity has a couple of sprites that come with the engine. I'm just gonna find a suitable sprite like that. Okay, the reason I assign a sprite here is because I want to preserve aspect. Okay, so that whenever we assign a sprite over here, this doesn't get distorted, because later we assign the character sprite, right? So depending on what character sprite you have here, you always want the character sprite to be proportionate. Okay, so I'm assigning a sprite here to get the preserve aspect option over here, and I can check it. Okay, last thing you want to do is you will see the weapons and passive items chosen actually are contained under the game objects here. Okay, and the images are all hidden and they're not responsive as well. Okay, so let's just delete these, and then we'll just copy the weapons and passives game objects and then paste it inside the results screen. Just gonna put it under the results screen like that, and this will, because these two elements are already responsive, so then I can just proceed and move the elements over to the bottom of the chosen character game object over here. So let me just move the weapons object first. Okay, so because these are already responsive, I can just go ahead and just set 0.55, and then I can just set the left and the right. Okay, then the anchor for the top and the bottom, I think I can also split it. So this will be 0.4, 0.5, and I'll set the top, bottom is 0 as well. Okay, so you might also want to go to slot over here and just increase the size of your slot depending on your preferences. All right, so if I increase the size of the slot, I probably have to increase the size of the text here as well. Okay, so if you do that, then again you have to generate icons to apply the changes to the rest of the icons, and you can do the same thing for the passives. Okay, or you can always just duplicate the weapons to get the passives. Okay, just remember, if you do that, then you have to set these to passive slots, and you also have to move the slots down like this, and there you go. So then now you have the weapons and passives, and of course after you do that, you have to always just shift the elements around like that to make sure that they are responsive, and you find maybe the items are not very responsive, right? Okay, so we perhaps have to also modify the slots over here, get the icons to be, let's see if we can actually get the horizontal layout group here to control the child height here, and then we can add a gap under passive, say 20 and 20 over here as well. Okay, so you just gotta play around with the settings a little bit until you get a set of configurations that are responsive. Okay, so the downside of it being responsive is that at certain screen sizes it may look weird. Okay, so again, one thing I like to do to fix this is I like to go to the canvas and then assign a screen size. Okay, so assign a reference resolution to make all the UI elements stay at a certain size, right? So when you resize the elements, there will still be different layouts depending on the resolution of the screen, but this becomes more consistent because now you're restricting the screen size to be a certain resolution, right? So with all these changes made, your result screen should now be responsive, and it should also be homogenized so that you have a UI element that is, give me a moment, so that you have inventory icon slots, right, that use the same component as the result screen. I think 1280 by 720 isn't very nice. Maybe I can try using a different reference resolution because the icons now appear very small. So perhaps, let me see what I can do to fix that. Icons here don't look nice. Is it because if I do constant pixel size, it looks nicer, right? Okay, you just gotta try different values and then you get something that works. Yeah. So if I decrease the reference resolution even more, you see the icons look a little bit better now. Okay, so you have to play around with the values over here to get the results that you want. It's the easiest way to do it. There are other ways to do it as well, but I prefer to just modify the canvas scaler to get the icons to be the way I want them to be. And that's about it for this part, really. So then the last thing we need to do is just to clean up everything, right? So the inventory slots, the old version, just delete that, and I think that's about it for this part. Yep, there we go. Okay, so when the game is over and you enable the results screen, you will see that the icons will always correspond to the weapons that you have. Right? So this is nice. So if I disable this and let's say if I get a new item, you will see that the results screen will also update itself. Okay, all using one script. Okay, there's no need for us to code different scripts to manage the icons differently in different places. Okay, it's all managed by the same script now. Okay, so again, if I open the results screen, see that the result screen is always updated with our latest weapons. So in the next part, we are finally going to go to the weapon, to the enemy spawning system. And in the enemy spawning system, we'll cover how we can spawn not only individual enemies, but also spawn patterns. So we can do things like, for example, the flower wall that you see in Vampire Survivor in the first level, and a whole bunch of other different configurations. Alright, so stay tuned for that.